Hey guys, Retro Game Club here. Today we're going to be doing a complete overview of all of the functions that are found within the RetroEvolved software. Now this tutorial is also applicable to RetroPie software, so if you're using RetroPie, don't fear, you can still get a lot of knowledge from this video. There's plenty of detailed specifics videos that'll go over all of the specific functions in RetroEvolved or RetroPie, but there's very little videos that go over all of the general questions that people usually have when they first get these consoles up and running. So we're going to go ahead and start with what's called EmulationStation. That's the front end of the software. That's the visual menu that you're seeing here. You can change the themes on it to look differently. You can adjust many of the settings in the menu here to customize it, personalize it to your tastes, and change its functions. So basically, when you first start your console, you're going to see a splash screen video, which is something that you can actually change to be whatever you want, but the standard RetroEvolved boot logo is going to look like this. And then the unique part about RetroEvolved in the start area is, you may notice if you're familiar with RetroPie, is there's no text and no logos showing up right now. And that's because RetroEvolved is customized right out of the box to not have any sort of hindrances of logos or bash text on startup, so it just goes straight into the console. And the amount of time that it takes to load will depend on the size of your hard drive that you have plugged in, if any, and how many ROMs you have installed on the drive, because the systems do look for every game that you have installed on boot up, so it is normal for it to take a little bit of time when it's starting up, especially if you have a really massive collection. So here we are. This is the screen that you're going to see the first time booting up RetroEvolved or RetroPie systems, and it's important to note that the controller that you use to do this setup, you must have in your possession. It can't be a buddy's controller that you're using at his house real quick and then you go home. You won't be able to set up another controller with this system unless you have the original controller that you used to set it up. I know it sounds a little silly, but to keep your life a lot simpler, just make sure that you actually own the controller you're using and you're not planning on losing it anytime soon. So basically all we're going to do is we're going to press a button on our controller, we're going to hold it down, and it's going to lead us through the first time setup. So basically just press the buttons on the screen that it tells you. If your controller doesn't have those buttons, you can skip it by holding down a button that has already been assigned to something. So up, down, left, right, start, select, A, B, X, Y, and feel free to press buttons that are different than the ones shown on the screen if you want to map the Y button to the X button, per se. If you want to swap them out, you can do things like that too. Just keep in mind, for all your games, those will be your configurations for the most part. This part, Hotkey Enable, is a new feature in the newest EmulationStation that allows you to change what your hotkey button is. Your hotkey button, typically you want it to be your select button. So typically people assign it to select. You can assign it to whatever you want, but this is going to be the button that you have to hold down to use any of the hotkeys that you want to assign for emulators. And what this means is, let's say you want to save your game live and do a save state at any moment in the game. You just hold down your select button and then you press like the left trigger, for instance, or the right trigger, and that'll save and load your game. But if you assign a different key, like the left trigger, to the hotkey, then that's going to be the button you have to hold down. To add a new controller, or to allow your keyboard to control the menu screen, you just simply press the start button on your controller or the enter button on your keyboard if you used a keyboard to set this up, and it will open up the EmulationStation main menu. On the main menu, you scroll down to configure input and press your enter button. I believe it's the space button on the keyboard, or the A button to select the option. Then it'll recognize any other keypads that you have. So for instance, here's the keyboard. You see how it's flashing there? It's because I'm holding the space button. I don't want to set that up right now. I want to change some of the configurations of this controller. So I'm just going to go back through the setup, and you just do this for every single controller in your possession that you want to be able to use with this console. And as long as you do that, you will be able to use any of those controllers to set up for your games. Now if you screw up and you accidentally don't press something, you can, at the very end when you finish the hotkey enable, you can use the up and down buttons to go back up to the option that you didn't successfully do, and press A on it, and then press the button that you want it to be corresponded to. And then you can just go back down, hit OK. So now we've mapped our controller. So what do all of these options mean? This is the basic EmulationStation menu. This is your front end, as I mentioned earlier. This is going to be what you see the majority of when you're controlling what console you want to play, when you're looking through your game collection. So it's really important that you master this main menu. So you access the main menu by hitting the start button, and I'm going to go through these options with you now. So Scraper, I don't recommend using. I'll go over it later. It's more of an advanced feature. The scraper that's built into EmulationStation, what it does, if you select it, it'll ask you where do you want to scrape from, and the only option right now is the games DB, scrape ratings, and scrape now. What this does is it looks through your entire game collection and it automatically tries to download box art for each game that you have. So that's very useful, of course. However, it doesn't give you the option in EmulationStation Scraper to choose where you want that artwork to go. It's just going to go straight onto your micro SD card, it's going to load it up, and if you don't have extra space, you may not want that, especially if you have a really large game collection. If you have a really small game collection and all you're looking for is art for your games, so that when you scroll through, let me give you an example here. Let's go to, I mean really I have art for all of them, I'll just do Game Boy Color. So, for my example, I have videos that I've used. But if you have box artwork, that's what's going to show up here when you're looking through your game collection. Now, how did I get videos? I didn't get videos through the internal scraper. You have to use a different feature, and I'll go over that later. It's a little bit more advanced. So, if you want to see artwork for your games, and you want to see box art, and you have a small game collection, then you can use the internal scraper. It's very easy. You just hit scrape now. You select only missing images, because obviously you don't want to get box art for the games you already have. You select the systems you want it to look for, and then this button that says user decides on conflicts, that means if it detects a game and it's confused about it, like perhaps you have it named 102 Dalmatians when it's supposed to be called 101 Dalmatians, it's going to ask you, hey, did you mean 101 Dalmatians or did you mean this other game? And it's going to do that for every single game it has a question about. So if you have a very small collection, you can leave that on. For most people, you're going to have to turn it off because you're not going to be able to manually decide on every single box art whether or not it's the correct one. So I would keep that feature off and then hit start if you want to use that. But like I said, there's a better method I'll teach you later. Under sound settings, this is a pretty simple menu. You really don't have to change it unless there's something wrong with your audio on your TV. So for audio device, PCM is the standard audio that is outputted by the Raspberry Pi. There's really not much you can do about it. This menu will only be changed for advanced features like setting up your home theater system with the Raspberry Pi. So the audio menu is pretty self-explanatory. You can change the inherent volume for everything in here. That'll change how loud the menu is, how loud the videos are that play when you're scrolling through. You can also adjust your volume on your TV, obviously. So usually I would just recommend leaving this at 80%, not jacking it up to 100. Navigation sounds, that's like the little clicking noises and select noises when you select consoles. So you can turn that on and off if you don't like it. Video audio, that is the audio that plays when you're scrolling through your game collection and you see videos like I showed you earlier. It was actually playing audio from the video because I have this feature on. For OMX player audio device, you're probably never going to change it, and in fact, in the example of this particular theme, which is called Space Oddity, it's one of my favorite themes, and it comes pre-installed with the non-commercial RetroEvolved image. You can not use the OMX player because it makes your videos kind of get smashed into the corner and they don't look very good. So OMX player is only used in rare instances if you want to speed up your video quality and you're not using a theme that's complex like the Space Oddity theme here. Okay, so the UI settings. First, you have the screensaver settings. This is where you go to do some cool little effects where if after 5 minutes of inactivity, your console will either dim the screen, make the screen completely black. So dim the screen, make it completely black, play a random video from your video collection. Now this means you have to have scraped videos for your games, or play a slideshow of box art or whatever you have in your folder that you want to do a slideshow of. So I suggest using the random video option if you have videos scraped, and again I'll explain more about that later towards the end of the video. In the video screensaver settings here, this is where you get to choose how the videos work. So let me first show you what it looks like. After about 5 minutes of inactivity, your screen will start to it'll just do whatever option you have selected. So in this instance, I have video selected. I have an option selected where I have it tell me the name of the game at the start and end of the video, but I make the video change after every 10 seconds because I like to see just random video games in my collection, because hey, who knows, maybe you'll see something cool, you can write it down and you can go try to play that game and see what it's like. Because if you're anything like me, you may have a lot of games in your collection that you haven't actually played, or that you haven't played in a really long time. So doing this cool little screensaver option gives you an idea what's in your collection. It's pretty neat. So let's talk about the options there and how to change them. So if you go to screensaver settings and you go to the video screensaver settings, you can change how long the videos will play before they change. I keep mine at 10 seconds. Use OMX player, that just speeds up the videos a little bit. I would suggest turning this on. Screensaver controls means that you can affect the video, I believe. I haven't actually tried to do that. I think you can change between videos, things like that. For show game info on screensaver, that's where it actually gave you the title of the game. So I set mine to start and end. That way the name of the game will show up in the screen here, and then it will fade away after a couple seconds. Personally, I turn on stretch video on screensaver because this makes the video take up the entire screen instead of just playing in the middle or whatever the dimensions of the video are. For slideshow screensaver settings, it's basically the same concept as the video, except you choose how long you want it to be between images. So 10 seconds is the default. You can stretch the images to fill the whole screen. You can choose if you want there to be some sort of music. You can put your own music collection on there. You have to choose what folder it is, so you will need a keyboard. It's a little bit more advanced because you're going to have to access your console either with Wi-Fi or SSH, or have something on a flash drive and use the internal file manager. One way or another, it is a little complex to get folders, to get audio and stuff like that into these folders. So I'm not going to cover that in the video, but if you happen to know how to do that already, or you want to learn how to do it in the future, you can check out the next series of videos where I'll go over some more advanced settings, and I'll go over that. But for now, if you know how to access this, then change the folder if you'd like, and you can put your music in there and it'll play the music while the slideshow goes on. Use custom images means you can use images other than the scraped box art images, and you can choose what you want it to be. So it can be pictures of your friends and family or memes you downloaded off the internet. Go crazy. For recursive, that means it's going to look in every directory inside the directory. So if you have a folder with a bunch of folders in it and they all have images in each folder, it's going to look through all of them. And then you can choose if you want it to be only .jpg images, only .png, stuff like that. So you can really go crazy in customizing all this stuff. So we've covered all of the screensaver settings. Now, quick system select. I don't really like the feature very much. If you have it on, what it does is, let's say you are in the menu of a particular console and you're looking through your games. If you press left or right, it's going to take you to the next console. So if you like that and you want to just go back and forth between your systems really quickly without having to back out and select it from this menu, then you can leave quick system select on. I personally turn it off so it prevents me from accidentally going left and right to different emulators, or rather different consoles. For carousel transitions, this is something that you want to have on, in my opinion. Carousel transitions makes it really smooth when it's scrolling through consoles. So you see how it kind of moves when you change between consoles? That's because carousel transitions is on. If you turn off carousel transitions, it just goes boop really quickly. And to show you what I mean there, this is what it looks like when it's off. So as you notice, the background art pretty much just instantly shows up and it doesn't really give you that nice smooth transition. So I usually leave the carousel transitions turned on. And then transition style is how it transitions between console to console. So I prefer the slide option, which makes the entire thing look really smooth as it switches from picture to picture. But there is also instantaneous, which boom, it just shows the console instantly, no movement whatsoever. And the fade option, which actually kind of makes it look like it's having trouble loading, in my opinion. I used to use this on my last batch of consoles that we shipped out, but I think it gives the impression that it's taking time to load, and I don't really like that. So all our new consoles come pre-set up to be on the slide transition. Theme, obviously you're changing your theme completely, so our RetroEvolved non-commercial, non-sellable images that you can download for free on retrogame.club come pre-installed with Space Oddity, SNES Mini, and Comic Book. Space Oddity is the one we're looking at. SNES Mini, give it a second to load. When you're switching themes, it has to reload all of the images, so it can take a moment. So this is the SNES Mini, which is really cool if you're into that sort of retro look. And then there is the comic book theme, which is very popular in the RetroPie community. Some of the best artwork that there is out there. And we've got this really cool comic book kind of style with really unique text. So there's many themes that you can download. I'll teach you how to do that later. Game list view style should be set to automatic most of the time. You can change it if you don't like seeing all of the extra details on the games, like their descriptions, how many times you've played the game, the community rating of the game, etc. But usually you like to have that extra info in case you haven't played those games before. And automatic will also automatically detect if you have videos or box art. So you don't have to select video. If you want it to show videos, you can leave it on automatic, and if you have videos downloaded, it will automatically play them as you're scrolling through your game collection. On-screen help, once you've mastered your console, you can turn it off and it makes this go away. So as you can see, that disappears. But when you're still learning the console, I suggest leaving that on so you can remember, okay, start activates menu, X goes to a random game, which is pretty cool, A selects things, etc, etc. Alright, going down that list, so let's go over game collection settings. This is a new feature in EmulationStation, the newest version. It will go ahead and do things like organize your favorite games that you've selected, which I'll show you how to add games to your favorites. This is especially useful for people like me who have really large game collections and they don't want to go scrolling through an endless list to find the games they want. Just add them to your favorites and they will show up, depending on your theme, they will show up in a little area that says favorites. Sometimes there'll be art artwork for it, sometimes not. It depends on your theme. If you're using one of the themes that comes pre-installed with RetroEvolved, then you're going to have some cool little artwork that says the word favorites, and then when you go in there, if you've added games, they're all going to show up right there. And last played, of course, is the games that you just recently finished playing, which I have right here. Alright, and then all games you can leave, if you have a small game collection, or if you would like to do searches, like a broad search for a game. Like let's say you want to play a game but you forgot what console it's for, then you can activate this all games collection and it will put every single ROM that you have in a folder called all games on your screen, and then you can basically just go through it and try to find the games that you have. Or if you have a small collection, then you can see them all on one screen. But if you have every game for every console and you're getting crazy like that and trying to archive the universe and everything, you're not going to want to have an all games folder because there will be 40,000 games in it, and that's not very useful unless you're doing a search like I just mentioned. For custom game collections, this is really theme dependent, so not all themes support it, and they certainly don't support every type of custom collection you could make, but it's basically for, like, let's say you want to have every single Mortal Kombat game in one folder and you want a cool Mortal Kombat logo to show up here where your other consoles would show up. If your theme supports it, then under your game collection on this particular theme, this is one of the best themes that there is available. Again, it's called Space Oddity. They've got many of these already set up for you, and then basically you choose one. For example, let's say the Sonic the Hedgehog games. So you can go to Sonic, it'll add this cool artwork and a logo for Sonic, and then you just have to add your games manually to this list. And the way that you do that is by going through your collection of Sonic games and pressing the Y button on each game that you want to add to this collection. Let's see if I can give you an example. We'll go to the Game Gear, Sega Game Gear. We'll do a quick search, which, by the way, you do searches by hitting your select button or your hotkey enable button. I think it's just the select button, to be honest. And then you can press A to go straight to that letter. And we'll look for Sonic. So here's Sonic and Tails 2. Now I'm going to press Y on that. And up here, added Sonic and Tails 2 to Sonic. So now, when we go to the Sonic collection that we just created, well, what do you know? There's Sonic and Tails 2. So that's a pretty cool way to curate your collection. If you're a real big fan of Sonic and you want all the games and you know you're going to want them all in one special folder, then go ahead and use those custom collections by theme, which is in game collection settings, and create no custom selection from theme. After you've finished adding your games to the custom collections, don't forget to go back to the game collection settings menu and go down and hit A, finish editing Sonic collection. If you don't, then anytime you press Y on something, it's gonna, instead of adding it to your favorites like it normally would when you press Y on something, it will add it to the Sonic collection. So to reiterate, if you're going through a folder of games and you want to add something to your favorites, you press the Y button, typically, and that adds it to your favorites list, which shows up here. If you want to add games to the new collection that you've made, just remember, you just click the collection, you press the select button on your controller, which will pull up this search menu or the options menu, and then you just go down to add and remove games to this game collection, and you press A. Then, from now on, whenever you go to a game collection that has Sonic games you want to add, like in Game Gear here, we want to go and add another Sonic game. Now when we press Y, it doesn't say favorites anymore down here, it says Sonic, and that's because we're adding games to the Sonic collection. So when you press Y, adds it to the collection, and now we've got 2 games in the Sonic collection. Now we want to say, okay, I'm done with that. Press select, hit finish editing Sonic collection, or go back to your game collection settings and hit finish editing Sonic collection. So that covers custom collections. You know, it's irrelevant if you sort custom collections and systems. That's personal preference. So that's at your leisure. You can decide what you want to do there. So now we're on other settings. We're almost finished. So VRAM limit. This one takes a while to understand. Logically, you would think, if I want to increase the performance of this console, I'll just jack up the RAM to 750 megabytes here and use up most of my active memory to make my console run smoother when I'm in these menus, right? A lot of people will have trouble because they'll raise it up to like 200 or like 600, thinking this is going to improve the performance in the menus, but it's actually kind of the opposite. So I recommend doing 80 megabytes if you have a large game collection and you have lots of videos that you're loading. That's a good happy medium to make everything load quickly, or else sometimes the images just won't load at all. So be very careful about changing VRAM limit. Power saver modes, just leave it disabled. Don't even worry about it. Save metadata on exit. This will increase the amount of time it takes for your console to shut down, so keep that in mind. But if you want your games to show you how many times you've played them over here in this little menu, then you're going to want to save that, to have that option turned on. Because if save metadata on exit is off, then it's not going to remember any of the games that you've played when you turn your console off. It's just going to try to turn the console off faster. So if you're in a hurry and you want your console to turn off really, really quickly, turn it off, but I recommend leaving it on. So these are more advanced settings. I would leave them all alone. They're really not going to impact you. I do recommend using OMX Player on most themes with video, but not on Space Oddity, as we've already gone over. And then there's show frame rate. That's obviously pointless unless you're trying to troubleshoot or bug test something that just tells you how many frames per second your system is outputting. Then you've got configure input, and now here's an option I probably should have covered at the very beginning, but when you want to shut down your console, you don't just unplug it, right? Just like you wouldn't unplug your computer from the wall to shut it down, or at least I sure as hell hope not. You want to go to the start menu and hit quit to shut down, and then you want to hit shut down system. That's the proper way to shut it down. After the green light disappears from your Raspberry Pi or your game console, you know that it's finally all the way shut down and it's safe to unplug, okay? And there's just one last thing to cover as far as the basics go. When you go into a game library, there's a few more settings that you can change. You've already seen this a little bit, but when you hit the select button, it's going to come up with the options menu whenever you're in a console and you're looking at the games. This is really important. You need to remember this because it lets you search your game collection. So if I want to go straight to Turok, I press the T, I select T, and then I can scroll down from here and I can go to my Turok games, right? So again, when you hit select, you can jump to a letter and search for that type of game. You can change how your games show up and what order they show up. You can sort them by community ratings. Now you have to have your games scraped for ratings for this to work, but if they're rated, which not all of them are, so remember that. But if your games are rated, which many of the games are, especially for the popular consoles like Super Nintendo and Nintendo and N64, then they're going to get a little rating here. And on this particular theme, it's denoted by these little moons. So this one's 3 stars, this one's 4 stars, this one's 3.5 stars. And if you organize your games by the rating, then obviously you can just see the community favorites at the top of the list and the least favorite ones at the bottom, or vice versa. You can sort your games by how many times you've played them, so that means your favorite games will immediately pop to the top. Sort them by when you last played them. This is a really cool option because it sorts them by how many players there are, And I think that's really cool for people who are trying to play co-op games or multiplayer. You can show all the multiplayer games right at the front and decide, hey man, let's play some co-op games, let's play some competitive games. Sort by release date, genre, who made it, who published it, and the system. This only really applies when you're in the all games category. Then you can filter the game list. This is something that you want to remember. If you're going to change this, remember to undo what you've done after you're finished for the most part, because this is going to permanently, if you don't go back on it and reset all filters, it's going to permanently change it to only action games are going to show up, only adventure games, and only strategy games are going to show up. And now when I go back, only action and adventure games are showing up, and I've just eliminated a huge chunk of my collection. So now I can scroll through the whole collection in seconds because it's only showing those particular genres. And then when you go to reset, that goes away. Now it's the full collection again. So keep that in mind. And then this is a cool feature. It's really painstaking. You wouldn't want to do this manually, I don't think. But let's say one of the games that you scraped had the wrong name. Or let's say you're tired of it being called GoldenEye Europe, and you want it to be called just 007 GoldenEye, right? So you can get your keyboard, you can edit that metadata, and then you go down to save, and it'll, save it to this list here. You can change the thumbnails of the games, you can change the marquee, which is this little thing up here, you can change what the video is. This is for people who really want to go in and they want their games to look exactly the way they want them to look. They want to choose the image that shows up, they want to choose the description. Like it says, you can change the description of the game to be, hey, this is my favorite game. But if you have the scraper option done, then all of this is going to be populated automatically. You can also rate the games what you want to rate them, so keep that in mind. And of course you can add it to your favorites. This is another way of doing it, but it's easier to just press Y. So that covers all of the EmulationStation basics for RetroEvolved and RetroPie consoles. Now we're going to get into the more advanced settings. So if you want to get to the advanced settings, you're going to scroll through your game list or your console list until you get to the RetroEvolved settings, or on RetroPie consoles, obviously it's the RetroPie settings. And then we have some options here. So we're just going to go down this list one by one. We're going to try to get this done pretty quick. So we're going to start with audio. Now the audio settings, usually you're not going to change this unless you're actually having a problem with the audio. There is a rare thing that happens once in a while on some TVs where your HDMI audio will not be transferred properly. Also, maybe you want to hook up a soundbar to your Raspberry Pi, and you can, or your game console. You can do this through your 3.5mm jack. So you can use that and hook it up to the auxiliary port on a soundbar or a home theater system, and that will bypass the HDMI audio. So in that instance, normally all of this is done automatically and you never have to change anything. So you're really only going to go here if you have a problem, but you can choose, I want my audio to go out the 3.5mm auxiliary port, I want my audio to go out through HDMI, I want to adjust the audio that's going out because it's too loud, too quiet, whatever, or I just want auto. So leave it in auto for the most part. Bluetooth is an option that sometimes gives people trouble due to the nature of how you get these things configured. It is not as intuitive as like hooking up a cell phone to a speaker, but I'll try to make it easy for you. The steps to pair a Bluetooth device are more simple than it would seem. Basically what you want to do is you want to press A on register and connect to a Bluetooth device. It then searches for your Bluetooth controller or whatever you're trying to hook up, and it will tell you what it finds in a couple seconds. Make sure that your device is in pairing mode, so make sure that the blue light is blinking quick on most of them. That's what it looks like. And then you choose your device that you're trying to pair up, and it gives you a few options here, and really just ignore them, ignore what they say, it doesn't matter. These are just different methods of connecting to Bluetooth in case one fails. Like seriously, 98% of the time when you choose the first option here, it just pairs up automatically and you have no trouble, okay? So once you get your device paired, if you have troubles with that, you can troubleshoot it online. If you've purchased a console from retrogame.club, then just reach out to us with support@retrogame.club and we'll help you out there. If not, just Google the solution. There's a lot of people out there who have reported any issues they're having, and will help you solve it. Then you can remove Bluetooth devices. You can display the devices that are connected. The UDEV rule is really only for 8-bit DO controllers, to my knowledge. There may be a few other controller types. For 8-bit DO controllers, which are some of the most popular retro gaming controllers, the brand is called 8-bit DO, so if you never heard of it, that's why it's called that. For them specifically, you do have to, after you do the register and connect a Bluetooth device, you have to set up a new UDEV rule. All you do is click it. That's it. You just click A on that option, or enter on your keyboard, and then you just choose the controller that you just paired. Once that's set up, you never have to do it again. You can also connect now to all registered devices, and you can configure the Bluetooth Connect mode. If you're having trouble where when you turn your console off and you turn it back on, it's not pairing automatically to your controllers, you can try changing these options. 90% of the time, just leaving it as default here is totally fine. Seriously, I've never had problems even with 8-bit DO controllers. I would just leave it default. There's probably something else afoot if you're having trouble pairing up. Okay, try turning the controller off and back on, stuff like that. But you can try changing it to connect to them once at boot, or to always try to do it in the background, but I leave it as default. And you can pretty much ignore this. This is for old 8-bit DO controllers. I've never had to use it on any of the 8-bit DO controllers I've purchased. So, configuration editor. This is, most of these are shortcuts, by the way. All of these same options can be found in the RetroEvolved setup option. So, if you want, you can just go straight to RetroEvolved setup, and that gives you full control over everything. These are basically just shortcuts. Configuration editor takes you to all the important configuration files for the console, for the emulators, for EmulationStation, for Retroarch, which controls a lot of the shaders and graphical enhancements for games, bezels, CRT filters, stuff like that. If you want to make changes, you're going to need a keyboard, so let's just get that out of the way. This isn't an easy, fun time area. This is for people who are pretty familiar with what they're doing. They know what these settings do, or they've at least looked it up on the internet and found a good guide. I wouldn't go playing around in here. The first option is to configure the libretro emulator options. What that means is all the Retroarch options are in here. Retroarch runs most of the emulators on a RetroEvolved console or a RetroPie console, and so you can go here to change almost all the settings for your games. So let's use N64 as an example. You can set up things like video smoothing, so that it basically, if you're using pixel shaders, you don't want this on, but it will use bilinear filtering to make your game look a little bit better. On N64, for example, you leave that off because N64 takes a lot out of the system, and it's usually quite difficult to emulate N64 games because it uses up more resources. So you wouldn't really want to do things like video smoothing necessarily, because you want to have faster emulation rather than trying to make a fancier picture at the expense of the speed. So aspect ratio you can change, just leave it unset. Most of the time you can change the render resolution. The lower this is, by the way, the better your game is going to run. So if you're having trouble with games not running at full speed, you can try lowering the render resolution. Video shader enable. These really, a lot of these options you can kind of just ignore because there's an easier way to change them, in my opinion. But while we're here, I'm going to tell you that for video shader enable, if you hit enter on your keyboard and you do true, I'm going to leave it alone for now, and then you go to video shader file, you can go through your list of shaders that are installed in your shaders folder on the console, and you can choose a shader which will change the way all the games look. Like it'll make them look like it's on a CRT television, or it'll make them look really bright, or it'll make them look more colorful, upscaling them, stuff like that. And you really just gotta kind of play around to see what each of those do. That's how to do that. I have a better way for you though, once we get to the Retroarch options and we start talking about that. So I'll just leave that for now. Overlay enable is how you change the bezels that'll appear on like the left and the right hand side of the screen. There's also some really fancy bezels for portable consoles, which will make like a square and it'll look like the actual console you're playing on the screen. It's pretty cool stuff. Overlay file is where you choose the specific type of overlay you want or bezel. Then there's choose joypad order. I'm not gonna go over that. You can use the analog stick as a D-pad, stuff like that. Then we have, okay, so now that you know all the individual options are the same for all of them, you can also do default options for all libretro emulators. I would be really careful about changing stuff here, because what works for one emulator may not be a good setting for another emulator. So it's not too wise to do that unless you're planning on spending a significant time of your day going through all these and fine-tuning them. Under advanced configuration, you can go in and you can configure every single individual configuration file for every single emulator manually. Okay, obviously you're not going to be able to know what all these configuration files are unless you go online and you look up, hey, how do I change this setting on this console to achieve this effect? This is where you would go to do those advanced configurations. Just all kinds of stuff, but that's super advanced. I'm not gonna go over it right now because that is not this tutorial. Okay, now you can go to, this is where you download themes. So we talked about that earlier. If you wanna get new themes, I'll tell you right now for RetroEvolved, we only have 3 themes that come with all the RetroEvolved imagery, but I didn't wanna limit our users just to RetroEvolved themes, so you can still download RetroPie themes if you want. It's just going to add all of those RetroPie logos to your console. So as you can see, when you go into the theme downloader, it's going to show you the themes that you already have installed here, and then it's going to show you the ones you don't have installed. So the very first ones here are all ones that are used basically on RetroEvolved non-commercial images and commercial images. So these can't be used commercially because the developers of these themes have made non-commercial licenses for them, so you're only going to be able to use them on consoles you don't plan on selling. So your personal console, feel free to download those. You can, right now the NBVA theme does not have any particular type of license on it. That's subject to change in the future, but as the recording of this video, it's currently a commercially usable theme. So right now, this one can come pre-installed on a image that is commercial, for commercial use, so you can actually sell it and not have to worry about getting sued or something. So you can go through here. This is the one that comes with RetroPie normally. It's called Carbon, Simple. There's a whole ton of them. So you just go through and you kind of experiment with these and see which ones you like. If you don't want to just install them randomly and test them out, there is an option to preview them to kind of get an idea. You can also go on the RetroPie website if you're super interested in RetroPie themes and you want to see more what they look like. But yeah, so let's talk about the file manager. I'm not going to go into it right now, into the actual file manager. I'll just tell you, if you want to manually change names of files, move stuff around, plug in a USB drive to your console and move a file off it onto the micro SD card of the console, that's where you would go to do that. So you can, it's basically turning it into a computer at that point. Raspi config is not really newbie friendly. It's where the high level stuff is done. In the end, if you really want to personalize your console, you're going to have to familiarize yourself with this stuff. This is for security. If you're going to enable SSH, which SSH is something that allows you to connect to your console through Wi-Fi or through your Ethernet. So you can connect to your console from one computer to the console itself, and you can transfer files onto it and change a lot of advanced stuff and control everything about it. So most people aren't really going to do that unless they're going to get real into it. But if you do enable SSH, you do want to change your user password to something other than Raspberry, which was the default password that comes with it, okay? All of our consoles come default called RetroEvolved. If you want to change that so that your console shows up on the network as something else, you know, like Steve's game console or whatever, you can change that under hostname. Keep in mind you will need a keyboard obviously to navigate these menus and type in things. For boot options, you can really, if you mess around in here, you might break something, but you can change some of the options. All of our non-commercial images already have this stuff configured for you. You guys probably won't use any of that stuff, to be honest. Under localization options, this is where you change your country, your keyboard layout if you're using this in another country, which you're probably not watching this tutorial if you are, unless you're in Europe. You can change your keyboard layouts, time zones, stuff like that. That'll help with things like YouTube down the road when you're using Kodi. You do need the proper time and date to get on there. So remember, hey, if I have an issue with time and date, I probably need to go in this localization options under RaSP config. Interfacing options, this is where you go to enable SSH, and for everything else, you probably don't care at all. You're probably never going to add a camera to it. You're probably never going to use VNC, SPI, I2C, serial, all that stuff. This is all really advanced developer content. SSH is pretty advanced, but you may want to familiarize yourself with it because it's the easiest way to transfer games onto your console without having to use a hard drive if you go down that road. Although obviously having a hard drive is the best way. But yeah, so if you want to get advanced with it, you're going to need SSH. You can enable it under interfacing. Overclock doesn't do anything on the new hardware, so that's for older systems that use Raspberry Pi 2, so don't even worry about it. Our systems come pre-overclocked when you order a Godly Mode console on RetroGame.club. Keep in mind, if you're going to overclock something, you're going to want a fan on it most likely, or at least a heatsink. We have a overclocking tutorial on the website, so just look for that. Advanced options, this is already advanced, but expand file system basically makes it so if you have a 32 gigabyte or a 128 gigabyte SD card, your image for the operating system may only be using, you know, like 16 gigs of that, assuming you have a lot of like pictures and videos and stuff like that downloaded, or if you have some ROMs downloaded on it. Using this option allows you to take that entire SD card size and use it to store games and do all your stuff. Overscan does exactly what it says. If there's black bars that are showing up on your screen and it's not really giving you the best quality screen, you can adjust the overscan settings to fix that. Memory split is really advanced. I wouldn't mess with it unless you're trying to overclock stuff and you know what you're doing. Audio, it's the same settings that are in the audio settings that we looked at earlier. Resolution is if you have like an ultra wide monitor you're hooking up, you may need to go in here and manually input that resolution. Or if you're trying to do a 4:3 monitor, you can change the resolution options here as well. And then we have I wouldn't mess with this because it can break a lot of stuff, but for certain emulators and for certain tests, you can enable a GL driver to mess with stuff. So, and then of course you can update it, and it just gives you a little quip about what it is. So that's RaSP config. So moving on to RetroArch. RetroArch gives you control over most of the emulators that come with RetroEvolved and RetroPie consoles. It's pretty much the brain behind the controller mappings and the shaders and the saving and the loading, basically all the stuff related to actually playing the games. So you can think of it this way. EmulationStation is the user menu where you go and you select your consoles and your games and you sort the games and all that. RetroArch is basically in control of the games themselves, how the games are played, all the settings for the games, and then RetroEvolved just ties it all together. So this is the RetroArch menu, and if you were to install a system like Laka, for example, this is practically the whole interface right here. So it has its own interface. You don't usually go in here except when you're initially doing some shader configuration or controller configuration, stuff like that. If you want to change the settings on your console for games, you're going to go here most of the time. So I'm not going to go over all these options. We're going to do that in another tutorial because there's a ton of options here. And this is, like I said, it just controls everything about the games. Generally, you're only going to access RetroArch from the RetroEvolved settings menu if you need to change where games are saved, stuff like that. So we're going to exit that. Netplay, that's something that really deserves its own tutorial as well. This is where you will go and you will type in your buddy's IP address, and you will link up and you can play your games through Wi-Fi together. It's pretty cool, but it's kind of tough to set up, especially if you're not living in the same house. It's not like Xbox Live where everybody's just connected super easily. This is done manually with IP addresses and stuff like that, so I'm not going to cover it here, but you can just look up a tutorial, you know, RetroPie Netplay or RetroArch Netplay, and you'll find somebody who's talked about this in detail, I'm sure. RetroEvolved Setup, I'm going to show you that last because that's where everything is at. So this is usually where you go. In fact, I very rarely use any of these other options. Almost always just go straight to the RetroEvolved setup. Runcommand configuration, this one's pretty neat. If you wanted to change what it looks like when you're booting into a game. The run command is the thing that happens between when you select a game and when the game actually starts. Without the run command menu, you can't even decide to change a setting for a specific game before it runs. So this is getting a little advanced, but if you understand how emulators work, an emulator plays games. Sometimes one emulator program will be better than another for a specific game. So let's say you have a game in your collection, it's not working on the default emulator that we have selected. You can go in to the run command menu and you can change that specific game to be a different emulator, right? So if you disable this, which is a very bad idea, then you will not see that menu when you select a game. The game will just start. There will be nothing that happens beforehand. Okay? All these settings should stay the same. I wouldn't mess around with them. Okay? There's really not much of a point in changing any of these settings. Especially the way that we have them packaged on the pre-configured RetroEvolved images. This is already taken care of for you. And I'm going to show you now what this actually does and why it's important. So with run command, like I said, is what happens between when you start a game and when the game plays. So let's just use a random Nintendo game. We're going to press A to enter the game, and then it's going to come up with this menu. Now, if you press A on this menu, or in this instance it's actually button 0, which for some crazy reason on this controller is actually the thumbstick. I don't know why. It can be changed if you go into the configuration settings. I'm just a lazy guy, so I didn't do it. But it's not always going to be A. Just keep that in mind. If it's not running, try pressing all the buttons on your controller when the game's starting. And then this menu is going to pop up. So the run command menu is where you go when you want to decide, hey, I would like to change the default emulator that runs for my entire console for a Nintendo Entertainment System, for example. And when you go into that menu, you can choose between all the currently installed emulators. We'll get into installing new emulators later. You're probably not even going to ever install a new emulator because most of them are already done for you on our non-commercial image. It's practically every single console known to man. But if you wanted to install a particular emulator, you can do so, and then you can select it by merely choosing a game and then pressing your button 0, usually A, before the game starts to get to this menu, change your default emulator. You can also, if a game isn't running properly and you want to, you really love that game, you really got to get it to work, you can try running that specific game on a different emulator. So if that game doesn't work well with one emulator, then change it to another just for that one game. That way you don't have to worry about screwing up your whole system, and you can kind of test it out with new emulators. Then you can change the video mode. There's a whole bunch of settings in here. A lot of them are not going to work on your particular television, I'll tell you that up front. You usually want to leave it at the default, but if, like I said, if there's a game that you really want to play and it's not working with your default settings, you can try coming in and doing things like changing it to a lower resolution, things like that, and that may help you get that game running. Conversely, you can also basically enhance your resolution to a higher resolution, but there's an easier way to do that, and that's to just use Retroarch and basically use your shaders and your upscale settings in Retroarch itself. You can change the Retroarch render resolution here, but I would do that in-game, to be honest. You can edit the custom Retroarch configuration for this. You can add a specific line of code that only runs for this game. And of course you can just launch the game. And then the game boots up, so. And then you've got your bezels, that's an overlay. And the effect on here is a CRT, but we're not gonna go too much into that. Because that's the whole RetroArch side of things. Okay, so we're gonna go back to RetroEvolved settings. So show IP, that's how you figure out what your IP address is. /screens is where you go if you don't like our RetroEvolved boot logo that shows you an ad, basically a fancy ad for Retro Game Club every time you start your console. You can go in here and you can change your splash screen. I'm not going to force you to use our custom splash screen there. You can go into choose splash screen, and if you have anything already dragged and dropped into the appropriate folder, which it tells you where it's located, home/pi/RetroEvolved/splash screens, then you can just put your splash screen video in there, and you can tell it, hey, I want you to run. We also have some default ones where you can change it. This will change it to an image of RetroEvolved, so instead of playing the video we have with Retro Game Club, it will just show a picture of the RetroEvolved logo. So if you prefer that, you can change it there. Most of these are pretty simple. You can disable the splash screen entirely. It's not going to speed up your boot, just so you know. So there's really not usually a reason to do that. If you have a ton of different splash screens, you can have them randomized. Okay, so that's pretty much all there is to talk about as far as splash screens go. And then there's Wi-Fi. So why would you use Wi-Fi on a RetroEvolved or RetroPie console, you may ask? Well, obviously you'd use it for Netplay, but that's not the only reason. You need it for updates. If you want to update RetroEvolved, you're going to need to connect to the internet. If you want to use what's called Samba, or server message block with Windows computers. This may all sound like jargon, but what that is basically is you can transfer files to and from your console without needing to do any crazy advanced SSH kind of stuff. So if you're not cool with downloading a special program on your computer just to transfer files onto your console, then you can go into Wi-Fi. You can go ahead and connect to a Wi-Fi network with the number 1 option. You're going to need a keyboard here, keep that in mind. Our Godly Mode consoles come with a wireless micro keyboard, but you can use any Bluetooth keyboard or USB keyboard that you have set up, and then you connect to Wi-Fi network. It's going to tell you what Wi-Fi networks are in the area. You will then press enter on the network that is, the one you're trying to connect to, and you will type in your password with your keyboard and then hit enter. It's that simple, guys. There's no special fancy trick to it. If the console isn't seeing your network, it's because it's too far away or something else is happening. Get in touch with us at support@retrogame.club if you purchased a console from us and you're having Wi-Fi troubles. Oftentimes you can disconnect/remove the Wi-Fi config and then redo it, and that will fix many issues that might pop up. And a really advanced option, which is an absolute last resort, is if for some crazy reason your keyboard is not configured properly, or it's not outputting the right keys when you're typing in your password, or something's going funky, you can basically manually put your password and your network name into this file on your SD card, your micro SD card, and then you can hit this option and it will basically take that information and manually put it in for you. So as a last resort, if you can't connect to your Wi-Fi, put your Wi-Fi network into a text file called Wi-Fi keyfile.txt on your micro SD card and pop it in your console, and then go to Wi-Fi and select import Wi-Fi credentials. So the last thing to talk about is RetroEvolved Setup. This is where you're going to go to do the majority of your configurations. I would go straight here. 9 times out of 10, if you're trying to change something about the console, you're going to do it there, except for Retroarch game and emulator specific stuff. So for visuals and other configurations, you're going to go into the RetroEvolved setup. This is also what you'll see if you decide to install RetroEvolved from scratch by downloading it directly off GitHub and compiling it from source. So that's the super advanced way of doing it. If you really want to know every little thing there is to know about RetroEvolved, then you can compile it from scratch, and this is the very first thing you're going to see, and it would be how you would install it onto the actual system. Now, this whole basic install option is useless to anyone who purchased a console from retrogame.club or downloaded the non-commercial image off our website, because it's already installed. So you don't need to do a basic install, so you can just ignore that. For people who are installing it themselves, you click it and it just installs all of the core and main packages that there are in the program. So if you want to update RetroEvolved, you can go to the update section, and once you're connected to Wi-Fi or have an Ethernet cable plugged in, it's going to connect to our server on GitHub or the various components of RetroEvolved. It's going to download all of the updates. Keep in mind, guys, that this is free open source software. It's continually being developed. There's a lot of updates that'll get put out there for these different various software that may not instantly be compatible with other elements of the software. So it's often a good idea before updating, ask yourself, do I really need an update right now, or is everything working fine? Has a publisher online said something about an update that warrants me doing it? Like, is it going to be a substantial improvement? You really just want to make sure that everything's stable before doing any updates, that's all. Or at least back up your system before you do an update, just in case, you know? So you can go to Manage Programs. This is where you'll install all the new emulators. It's where you'll change the majority of the programs that are installed on your system, okay? So consider it like your programs list. And we have to manage the core packages. This is where all the major portions of the software are. So EmulationStation, Retroarch, RetroEvolved itself, and Runcommand are all here. Main packages are all the primary elements of RetroEvolved that generally come on our non-commercial image. So it's pretty much all the best emulators and all of the programs that you're going to use. There's not much to talk about in here other than at the bottom. I need to let you know that in the main packages section, you're going to find two very, very important things. One is USB-ROM service, and one is splash screen. So USB-ROM service is what allows you to plug in a USB hard drive to your console and have it read all of your game ROMs and actually play them directly off the hard drive. RetroPie consoles do not come with the ability to plug in a hard drive right off the bat. You do have to go in and turn these features on. On RetroEvolved, this has already been done because it's such a popular feature. We felt it should be included on every console. And then you have the splash screen service itself, which is where you go and you can do all of those features that you saw on the splash screen list earlier. Of course, you can also update each of these elements inside this menu. Now, this can be very useful to upgrade individual elements like that. That's often safe to do. So you can enable and disable USB-ROM service from there, and in fact that is a troubleshooting step which I'll go over in a moment. So you can manage optional packages here. This is where you go and you install the emulators that didn't come pre-installed on your RetroEvolved or RetroPie console. I really do not recommend installing all of them simultaneously. You probably won't use many of these. But let's say there's some games on MAME, which is an arcade emulator, but they're only available on version 0.94, or they work better on 0.94. You can install that version of the emulator, install your ROM set, and then you'll be able to choose that from the run command window when you're first launching a game. So you can say, hey, I'm going to launch this arcade game now, but I want this version of MAME to run it. Also, for things like light guns, Advanced MAME 1.4 is going to be a lot easier to configure for things like light guns, and that's basically the only way I personally know how to get a light gun to work with a Raspberry Pi based console. So keep that in mind. If you ever want to do light guns, you're probably going to need to download Advanced MAME 1.4. Then there's just tons of little emulators in here that you can do. There's a few things that we've already installed for you, such as the Intellivision emulator, the PlayStation Portable emulator. These things don't come pre-installed on RetroPie consoles. They do on our RetroEvolved non-commercial images, because these are some of the most popular consoles out there. So why wouldn't you want to be able to emulate PSP? Dreamcast is experimental. That's why it's not often included in these types of images, because Dreamcast has maybe like 40% compatibility right now. It's a tough one to crack. So not all Dreamcast games work, that's for sure, and it is a little bit of configuration to get it up and running. It doesn't just work right out of the box. You do have to change some things. We've got Scum VM, which is a emulator for point-and-click adventure games. We always install that on our non-commercial images because you get some really cool LucasArts games. You've got WonderSwan, ColecoVision. A lot of these, pretty much all of these that are installed that you're seeing here do not come on RetroPie images. So it's another thing that sets RetroEvolved apart. It also comes pre-installed and configured with Kodi, Super Mario War just for fun, so you have a game to play right off the bat. Solaris, which is some really cool open source Zelda games you can play. And yeah, and you can download Doom, all kinds of stuff on here. So just, you know, read the little description on the bottom, see if you want to install it, and keep in mind that all of the things that are in the optional and experimental packages are probably going to need some configuration to work. You can't really just install them and expect them to work right off the bat. You do have to configure things. I know it's unfortunate. Under driver, you're probably never going to do anything in here unless you have an Xbox or Xbox 360 dongle that you want to use with your Xbox 360 controller, or if you have an X-Arcade joystick, which are some pretty popular joysticks you can plug into the consoles. The Steam controller is compatible if you download the driver for it. You can hook up PlayStation 3 controllers, but they don't work right out of the box. You do have to download these drivers first, and you just go into the driver menu to do that. Under experimental packages, we get all the crazy stuff. Oh, I don't know why this isn't installed on here right now, but on all non-commercial images, we do include the Drastic emulator for Nintendo DS. It is fantastic. It is very high percentage of compatible games that are playable with that. We also include in our images a lot of experimental packages that don't come with RetroPie. They do require some advanced configuration. Here's a good example: Streets of Rage Remake. It's a really awesome fan-made project that completely redesigned Streets of Rage and gives you all the characters, and you play through a completely different story with really great graphics, stuff like that. A lot of these will be in the experimental section, and that's another thing that sets RetroEvolved apart from RetroPie, of course. So go in here, keep in mind you're going to have to do a lot of configuration to get these to work, especially with things like Firefox and Chromium. There is some extra work that needs to be done looking up things on the internet. I'm not going to detail that in this tutorial since this is just like an overview, but that's what you've got. Oh, you know, open source Civilization game. There's all kinds of cool stuff. Lots of free games in there too. So that's the programs menu. Then you've got configuration/tools, which is where you'll spend the majority of your time changing options on the console. You've got every possible thing that you can do right here at a glance. It's really easy. So earlier I said I was going to tell you a troubleshooting step for playing ROMs off a USB hard drive. If you ever have trouble getting your USB drive to be read after you've followed the instructions on the website, if you're trying to hook up a new hard drive to a console, you're probably going to need to go update. I'll go back. You're probably going to need to update RetroEvolved. Immediately after updating, you will go to USB ROM service. You will then disable it, and then you will enable it, and that fixes most problems with hooking up an external hard drive in case you ever have an issue with it. You can also, there's the splash screens yet again, so you can configure the splash screens. We've got Samba. Okay, that's something important to talk about. Samba and SMB is what I was talking about earlier when I said you could transfer files over Wi-Fi without having to do some crazy fancy SSH stuff and download programs. If you have Windows computers on your network, they all communicate with one another with something called Samba or SMB, which is server message block. And that's basically just the way that these computers share files. So if you install RetroEvolved Samba shares by clicking yes here, it's going to install them, and then your console will show up on your network and other computers will be able to send files to and from the console. So it's really convenient for adding games or adding your own splash screens, for example, changing box art for games, adding videos, stuff like that. And the rest of these are pretty self-explanatory and just used for configuring and bug testing Samba. So you can restart the service, remove it, and then reinstall it, stuff like that. There's Runcommand again. So like I said, pretty much all of the options that are in that menu are also available in the RetroEvolved setup. Then there's Retro Netplay. This is an option that allows, if you're having issues playing games and they're not being read for some crazy reason, once in a blue moon, it's due to an issue where your console isn't like technically giving permission to access those folders. So you can reset the ROM directories and the ownership permissions, and that will sometimes fix some of those issues. There's Raspbian Tools. This is the same thing as clicking the Raspi config option. There's the themes again, so if you want to install new themes, you can do it right there. EmulationStation, here's a configuration option where you can clear and reset your input configuration. So when you restart the console, it's going to ask you to basically reconfigure your controller. You can also switch your A and B buttons in case they're reversed. So if you want your A to be B and B to be A, you can change that right here. DiskManX is a utility that some emulators use. It's optional. Sometimes it will help with game playability on certain games. So you can install that if you feel like it. It's something you're going to want to research online before you do. Console font, you can change the type of font here if you want. You can also change the configurations. It's the same thing that we saw earlier, same Bluetooth menu we saw earlier. Bash welcome tweak is not something you're going to use. It's pre-enabled on RetroEvolved images, and all it does is it makes it so when you hit F4 on your console, it gives you some information about the console. That's it. We have auto start. This is a feature you only use when you're compiling RetroEvolved from source and you are setting it up for the first time. It won't run itself automatically, so you go here and you say, hey, I want Kodi to run every time I turn my console on. I want that to be the first thing that runs. Or, hey, I want EmulationStation to be the first thing that runs. And that is what is by default. So be careful messing around with stuff like that. Then you got your audio settings, you got your Retroarch settings, and you've got a section specifically for the Dreamcast emulator. And yes, it is that complex. So sometimes you really need to get nitty-gritty with these Dreamcast configurations to get them to work. People have been trying really hard to get Dreamcast compatibility up more, and so that's why that is there. Then of course you can update the RetroEvolved setup script. You can uninstall it if you want to completely delete it from your console, but that's going to be gone. And you can reboot your console. Okay, and the last thing I've got to show you guys, I promised you I'd show you at the very beginning, it is the really cool feature that comes pre-installed on RetroEvolved consoles, which is the Advanced Image and Video Scraper, which was designed by the very talented Steven Self. Give credit where credit's due. And it is basically the best way to get videos and descriptions and artwork for all of your games. It goes to the most popular servers online, and it can get artwork and videos for just about every single console out there. And with our RetroEvolved consoles, we've set it up so that you will have a default user and password for one of the best scraping services out there. And you're going to be able to download a lot of videos that you otherwise could not, namely on RetroPie consoles. You'd have to go in and manually edit some of this code to incorporate a username and password. So we've done that for you, we've done the legwork, and basically I'll show you where it's located, but you can't access it here right now because you have to do something. I'll tell you in a minute. Go to Manage Programs. And then when you go to optional packages, where all good things lie, it's at the very bottom of the list. Now, if for some crazy reason it did not come pre-installed on your console, which should not be the case, and I'm not using our official image right now. I'm using an experimental one that we're developing. So if it does not come pre-installed for some crazy reason, simply connect your console to the internet and select OK on the scraper option and install it from source. And after it's installed, you can go down to configuration options, and it will tell you that this cannot be run while EmulationStation is running. And the reason why it cannot be ran while EmulationStation is running is because all of the new data that you put into the console is generally going to be overwritten by EmulationStation while it's running, so it will just undo everything that you did. So what we do here is, this is going to be, hopefully it's not your first time doing this on a Raspberry Pi console, but if you're watching this tutorial, it probably is. We're going to go into the terminal, and since at the core of RetroEvolved and RetroPie consoles is the operating system Linux, and Linux is controlled with terminal most of the time, at least the version that we're using, and you access it on one of our consoles by hitting the F4 button on a keyboard while you're at one of the main menus. And what this does is it closes out of EmulationStation and it gives you some text. It says RetroEvolved, tells you the time, etc., the version of Linux, and from here we're going to do a few commands which are going to get you back into that RetroEvolved menu. Okay, so it's a good thing to memorize these. So what we're going to do is we are going to use the command cd space RetroEvolved, and you have to keep the R capital and the E capital and a capital S, so RetroEvolved setup, and that will move you into that directory. So make sure you type it exactly the way you see it on the screen. I'll zoom in here to help make that a little easier. And from there, you're going to type in sudo /retroevolved_setup.sh, and that is going to open up this familiar screen that you're probably very used to by now. And from there, now we can go ahead and go into the scraper. So we're going to go down to Manage Programs again. We're going to go to Optional Packages, and we're going to go all the way to the bottom where all the good things are, and we're going to click Scraper. We're going to go to Configuration/Options, and most of these settings, if you're getting a pre-made RetroEvolved non-commercial image, most of these are going to be done already. They're already going to be the best settings. You'll probably need to go online to get the full details on specific consoles, but the best thing that you can do, the best settings that you can use to get the most results is going to be from Screensaver and using the no intro ROM names. And for game list, there's a few options. There's append or overwrite. If you have some existing images and videos already, then you probably don't want to overwrite them and waste time. You probably want to append. Or if you're adding, let's say for example you use Screensavers to get your arcade games and your console games, to get videos and pictures for them, and it doesn't get all the games that you wanted. So you switch it to OpenVGDB and Arcade Italia. And you try to fill out the rest of your list with those two. Well, you don't want it to be set to overwrite if you do that, because then it's going to delete the ones that you have and replace them with only the ones that were found on these two sources. So you want to leave it append, which will make it so that it combines what you already have with the new things that are downloaded. So I recommend keeping Screensaver for console source and arcade source. I recommend using thumbnails only unless you have a massive hard drive, because this is going to take up a lot of space already. And then I would use the no intro ROM names, and I would use the ROM folder for the game list and images. This is really great for not filling up all the space on your micro SD card. You can, with this scraper, you can get all of your videos and pictures for each game stored onto your actual hard drive with all your games. So that's the best thing that you can do, in my opinion. Do not enable download videos if you do not have a decent sized hard drive to store these on. Videos are going to take up a pretty good bit of space, so keep that in mind. It's also going to take a very long time if you have a big game collection. To put it into perspective, it took 3 entire days to get videos for every single game that we have in our collection, because we have a pretty massive collection. So it can take a lot of time if you're doing videos. Keep that in mind. Download marquees. Marquees are a third type of image that you can get other than box art and title screen art, and it basically just gives you the name of the game, and sometimes themes will incorporate that marquee into the theme. So I recommend keeping it enabled if you have the hard drive space. Keep the image width and height the same unless you have specific needs otherwise for your theme. You'll know this if you go and you research your theme and see if it needs a particular width or height, but you can leave this default on the themes that come pre-installed with RetroEvolved. And then of course you can update the scraper. When you're ready to download all of the pictures and videos and all that cool stuff, and you have a lot of time on your hands if you're doing videos, remember, you can go to Scrape All Systems, or if you're just trying to test and see, hey, are these settings good? Is everything working right? You just choose one of your ROM folders to get images for. And then you just click it, and it'll go through a long process and it'll automatically download everything. And then if you have some games that don't have images or videos, you can go here to arcade source and console source. You can change it to a different source and try to fill out that collection. And guys, amen. That is it. That is every single option in RetroEvolved and RetroPie for the EmulationStation side of things covered. So you should now be an absolute master at configuring the way that your console looks, setting up Bluetooth controllers, connecting to Wi-Fi, doing all kinds of cool stuff. So the next video we're gonna do, because I don't think it's gonna fit into this video, is we are going to talk about Retroarch, which handles the game side of things, and that's where we're gonna go and do our shaders and our bezels and all that fancy stuff. So see you on the other side, guys. Deuces.